Leuven Colloquia on Ancient Platonism. And it's a great honor for us to have a very prominent, eminent scholar among us today, all the way from Canada, Professor John Magee, who is professor at the Institute or at the Center of Medieval Studies. He's known for many things, for his work on Boethius, for instance, which will be the topic also of his talk today. Boethius on the Soul is the title. We're also very grateful for him for his excellent, commendably precise and accurate translation of Chalcidius, which everyone working on Chalcidius knows how difficult the text is and how good the translation is. So we're very happy about that, John. John has also been working a lot on the, let's say, the commentary on De Interpretatione, or commentaries on De Interpretatione. And we're looking forward very much now to hear his thoughts on Boethius on the Soul, please.
Is this the microphone I should be? Okay. Is it working? Okay. No, I think this is, if it's working okay, I'd rather do this. Well, thank you. Jan, Roberto's out there with his tennis racket somewhere in Rome, I suppose. I want to thank him. He extended the invitation on behalf of the center to me. And Thanos and Arthur, who did all of the legwork that enabled my coming here and getting into the hotel and all this kind of thing. I very much appreciated. But there's a deeper sense of debt I have vis-a-vis Leuven. First of all, this is my first time here. My visits to Belgium over the years, decades, have been occasioned almost exclusively by a chase for manuscripts. So I followed the path of those, and they didn't, as it happened, since the 1980s, lead me here. Nevertheless, there have been two strong connections, and since the first of my graduate student days in the late 1970s at the Pontifical Institute in Toronto, I felt the presence of Leuven because so many of the faculty who taught there and at the University of Toronto in the philosophy department and classics had spent time here in the 50s, mostly in the 1950s, and that intellectual tradition, they brought it back with them, and it very much influenced and shaped ways in which we were taught, especially medieval philosophy, back up until the 70s, really, till things began to change as they have in so many ways and so many places. That's one. And the other is, just one more connection I hadn't thought of, but two, I didn't know I was going to see Gretchen here today. Roberto's online. Angela, I've known for some time, which is to say that there's a very rich feeling once I hit that threshold where I was in the older part of the equation. And then there were a lot of younger people who I were either coming from or on their way to, in many cases from Toronto, to Leuven to spend time for sort of philosophical, scholarly enrichment and just general interaction. Those are the debts I feel. And so it brings the circle around for me, closes it to be able actually to come here and speak to you today. As Jan mentioned, the title is Boethius on Soul. I actually have it as Boethius on the Soul, but the soul is in parentheses because my native English isn't really up to the task of deciding whether the soul targets individual souls, whereas just simply the anarthrous soul is the world soul. But since I want to try to deal with both in different connections, this is one ambiguity that's built into the title, and I will try to disambiguate that as I proceed. All right. Anicius Manlius Severinus Boethius' literary career spanned the first quarter of the 6th century, from De Arithmetica dating to circa 500 to 506, to the Philosophiae Consolatio, which was written sometime between his arrest in the fall of 523 and the death of his father-in-law Quintus Aurelius Memmius Symmachus, consul 485, and died in either 525 or 526. In 510, the year of his consulship, he was writing the second book of his commentary on Aristotle's categories, prior to which he had completed De Arithmetica, De Musica, the text which we still have, but is not complete, and his first commentary on Porphyry's Isagoge. And in about 522, the year of his appointment as Magister Officiorum in the court of Theodoric the Great, Boethius was deep into topical theory with a commentary on Cicero's Topica, a text which has also been translated incomplete, and a monograph entitled De Topicis Differentiis, evidently his penultimate work. These chronological preliminaries are directly relevant to our subject today insofar as they provide a context for understanding the constraints laid by our available sources as concerns Boethius's view of the soul, or soul. One way of conceptualizing the problem might be to imagine the circa 1,450 pages of Aristotle in Becker's Prussian Academy edition as stretched out across a continuum representing the period from circa 500 to circa 525, and then calculating the proportion known to have been translated and or commented by Boethius and the period within which it falls. If we also include Porphyry's Isagoge, then we're looking at a rate of completion at about 14% of the plan that Boethius had set out for himself as concerns just Aristotle, but Aristotle plus Porphyry, i.e. not Plato, all falling within the period from circa 509, when he probably began the first of his three drafts of the categories, and circa 520, when he turned to the works on topical theory. What we have at one end of our imagined continuum, in other words, are his translations of the Isagoge, categories, on interpretation, prior analytics, topics, and sophistical fallacies. Some of them with remnants of alternate drafts, scholia, and or commentaries. Unless we underestimate the productivity, account should also be taken of lost or unfinished works, such as his posterior analytics, which has never been found, and his physics, which I think he did write and also didn't survive or has not been found. Important for our purposes today, however, is the absence of De Anima, probably also the Parva Naturalia, apart from a passage from Book 3, Chapter 8, which is quoted in Greek and translated into Latin to explain a phrase at Perihermenias 16a9, ales gar pragmateias, where Aristotle says at the beginning of that treatise, this is not the subject of investigation for here, it belongs to another investigation. But then Ammonius draws the same connection, or nearly the same connection, and we won't go too far wrong in guessing that Porphyry also did the same in his lost commentary. None of this, however, even begins to touch Plato. On what basis, then, are we to assess Boethius's account of soul? We might, in fact, begin by turning to Plato, perhaps paradoxically, that is, by turning to the Boethian works that fall outside that broad central period just discussed, namely, at the front end, De Arithmetica and De Musica, circa 500 to 509, and at the other end, the Consolatio, 524, let's say. For the former works involve connections with the cosmogony of the world soul, while the latter offers scattered but deep insights into the nature of individual souls. And that is the plan I shall provisionally adopt for this presentation. But first, two thoughts concerning the status questionis and what follows from it. First, there is, to the best of my knowledge, only one scholarly study dedicated exclusively to our topic, and that is Volker Schmidt-Kohl's published dissertation entitled Die neue platonische Seelenlehre in der Consolatio Philosophiae des Boethius, 1965. It consists of 5 sections, each of which treats of a particular theme. First, the apparition of Philosophia at the beginning of the work. Second, the cave simile, including sub-themes, soul's imprisonment, its enchainment, and its conversion. Third, select Neoplatonic Grundbegriffe, such as one versus many, diffusion versus concentration, internal versus external, and so on. Fourth, the mythical scheme, as Schmidt-Kohl called it, and that includes ascent, exile, inebriation, amnesia, and so on. And finally, the anthropology, where the focus is on the theme of homoiosis theo, overcoming fortune, the soul between God and beast, etc. Schmidt-Kohl's method was grounded in the German tradition of Quellenforschung and focused on allegorized literary motifs, which in many cases had previously been identified by Friedrich Klingner in 1923, based on his, Klingner's, investigation of Proclus and others. To give you a sense of how it works, I'll mention two examples, one of them of general interest and the other directly relevant to our theme. The first concerns several details of Philosophia's appearance as depicted in the opening prose sections of the Consolatio, where Schmidt-Kohl explored the Homeric origins of Philosophia's homemade gown, for example, so an allusion to Athena in Iliad 5, Boethius's astonishment on first seeing her, so Achilles, Iliad Book 1, and Neoplatonic or Stoic-Neoplatonic allegories of Athena, qua Phronesis, Plotinus 6.5, Proclus, Intimium, book, first volume, page 252 in Van Riel's edition. His observations undoubtedly deepen and enrich our understanding of Boethius's literary and philosophical culture, but they overlook one clear allusion, the philosophical implications of which strike at the heart of what the Consolation is about. Namely, in the opening description of Philosophia's appearance, the Latin of which is as follows: mihi visa est mulia reverenda ad modum vultus, etc. This is a Latin rendering of Plato's Crito 44a, educatis moi gune, cale kai eades, and so on. There's no doubt about it. If you look at Cicero De Divinatio 152, if you look at Chalcidius chapter, when he says, and here's the passage in the Crito, and he translates it into Latin, all three authors come up with the same Latin. And so this can't be coincidental. This Latin in that opening passage immediately stimulates curiosity about the discussion of swan songs in Plato's other prison dialogue, namely the Phaedo, and correspondingly about the whole poetic construct of the Consolation of Philosophy. Why the poetry? Neither allusion qualifies as Neoplatonic, despite the title of Schmidt-Kohl's work, Neue Platonische Seelenlehre. Of course, but both are essential to an appreciation of what Boethius was trying to achieve. The point being twofold. Neoplatonic is used very loosely. It's a cover for Numenius when it's convenient for him to bring Numenius in. It obscures the degree to which Plato himself, not any later Platonic tradition, is directly influencing that work. And there's a point I'm going to need to get to in this regard later. In prison, awaiting death, is it really possible that he was consulting commentators? Secondly, as to the soul more precisely, the results are similar insofar as Schmidt-Kohl isolated motifs expressed in phrases such as the following: bene sibi mens conscia terreno caracero resoluta caelum libera patit. A mind fully self-aware, loosed from its earthly prison and free to seek the heavens. Or animos calce peripetitos, minds brought down from their lofty abode and locked into limbs. He isolated such phrases in order to target general themes such as that of proodos and epanodos, egress and regress. Another Homeric, but in this case not Iliadic, Odyssean, allegories is found in the works of philosophers from Numenius to Macrobius. The encyclopedic collection of material is impressive and useful, but has the effect of making Boethius look rather like the hub of a wheel, excuse me, out of which philosophical themes aimlessly radiate in all directions, when the real concern, in my opinion, is to understand the philosophical implications of their convergence upon him. When you're citing Homer in that way, and you're pointing out the various allegorical interpretations among Stoics, but mainly Platonists thereof, what you want to know is what Boethius did with those. He's not tossing them out into the air for no purpose. And this is a shortcoming that was noted already by Matthias Baltus in 1980. Second, the material we are about to review does not add up, full disclosure, to what can fairly be described as a watershed in the history of Platonic speculation about the soul. Among Boethius's greatest gifts was his power of combination, his ability to gather from the Latin and Greek traditions what could be repurposed for a post-Roman epoch in the history of philosophical education. In the case of the mathematical works, this meant incorporating Nicomachus, Ptolemy, and others, Aristoxenus, Euclid, and so on, with an eye to the formation of a quadrivium, fourfold path, the four methods, as Nicomachus calls them, which in the 9th century would anonymously be supplemented by a trivium, a threefold path, to form a closed system of 7 liberal arts, the enkyclios paideia. And in the case of the Consolatio, at the end of our spectrum, it meant invoking a psychology that would provide assurance about the unshakable order of the world and the well-being of his own soul, no matter what the outcome of his imprisonment. Boethius gathered, in other words, what was needed for him to console himself, rather than to satisfy any pedagogical aspirations he might otherwise have had, namely to write a treatise on the soul, commentary on the De Anima, whatever. That by way of introduction, and brings me to the first part of the talk, Anima Mundi, and we'll begin to look at the handout. Let us begin then where Boethius did with De Arithmetica and De Musica, and the Cosmopoeia, the Psychogonia of the Platonic world soul, to which he explicitly refers in the former work, but not in the latter. In the prefatory dedication to Symmachus, his father-in-law, he describes De Arithmetica as his first publication, Laboris Mei Primitias, while declaring his debt to Nicomachus's Introductio Arithmetica, which, unlike some unnamed other exposition, perhaps an oblique reference to Apuleius's translation, he abbreviates, supplements, and clarifies as he deems fit. What this means is that in the case of De Arithmetica, Boethius's Timaeus is to some degree mediated. And since Nicomachus's Institutio survives, unlike his Institutio Musica, we are in a position to assess some of that, at least some of that mediation. I shall attempt a brief review of the 3 passages, all from De Arithmetica, in which Boethius mentions the Timaeus, taking them in the order of the relevant Stephanus numbers. The first passage is De Arithmetica 246, first on the handout, in which Boethius addresses the question of why plane numbers or figures involve one geometrical mean, but cubic ones or solids 2, and then references the Timaeus, 32a to b, unlike Nicomachus, who speaks of the matter as being beneficial simply eis Platonicon ti theorema, for a certain Platonic theory. Commentators have noted that whereas Plato counterfactually stipulates one mean as sufficient to bind plane figures, mia mesotes an exerce, and then 2 to bind solids, Nicomachus explicitly limits the principles to 1 and 2 respectively. And he says, hes monos mesos duo monoi mesoi. And in that regard, he is followed by Boethius with the phrase, which you'll see there, una tantum medietate geometrica, duas tantum medietates. So far, he's doing nothing original. He's more or less translating Nicomachus. However, but mentioning the Timaeus. However, Boethius bypasses Nicomachus' stipulation of consecutive or conjunct squares and cubes, which is of consequence for 2 reasons. First, insofar as single geometric means between plane numbers consisting of, for example, the prime integers 2, 3 on the one hand and 5, 7 on the other, insofar as they will be irrational, they'll lead to the square root of 210, which is 14.49, whatever. Whereas conjunct squares based on the integers a squared and a plus 1 squared will be bound by single rational means that can be expressed in the form a times a plus 1. And the most obvious example would be the first square and the one that comes immediately after, 2 and 3, where the termini will be 4 and 9, and the mean will be the combination of 2 and 3, 6, in a sesquialter relation of 3 to 2. And that will be the binding analogia that holds the thing together. Secondly, it is of consequence because insofar as certain solid numbers or cubes can be expressed as geometric means bound by a single, not two means, ratios bound by a single mean, not two, Nicomachus's stipulation avoids a potential complication in Plato's theory. And this is most obviously illustrated by the first cubic number, 2 to the third, 8, which where 64 will be the mean, the single mean to bind it to 512. 2 to the third, 2 to the sixth, 2 to the ninth. Two means are not required. Boethius, I suspect, sought in cognizance of the fact that the Platonic theory has a certain amount of subtlety and potential complication, which might not fit to the oversimplifying expression of Nicomachus, sought to strike a balance between bringing the Timaeus back into view by actually mentioning the work, while taking advantage of Nicomachus's push for pedagogical clarity and simplicity. The second example, De Arithmetica 2:2, second on the handout, similarly intersects with the world body but points toward the world soul. Boethius, once again following Nicomachus, is concerned to give a general account of elements, letters in the case of syllables, sounds in the case of melodies, and earth, water, air, and fire in the case of the world. His overarching point being that elements are those simplest entities of which composites are formed and to which they are again resolved. The QED in context concerns number or multitude per se, what he calls in Latin aequalitas, and unity, and number ad aliud, or the dyad, as the elementary principles out of which all other numbers grow, into which they resolve, what he refers to as the procreatio prima and the postrema resolutio. His proof, put that in scare quotes, is an exercise illustrating how to reduce a ratio of 1 to 4, 4 counting for the 4 elements, to equality, 1 to 1, via the ratios of 1 to 3, and the numbers he selects are, his base number is the first cube, 8. So you would have 1 to 4, 8, 32, 128. Unity will be 8 to 8 or 1 to 1. And we will get there from 4 to 1 via 1 to 3, 8, 24, 72, and to 8, 16, 32. That could be reversed, and you would show how the elements grow out of unity, but he chooses to show how they reduce to unity. That done, he dutifully recalls Nicomachus's recommendation of this most sophisticated theorem as especially useful for the Platonic psychogony. But he changes the phrasing. He says, ad Platonicam intimaeo animae procreationem. And then adds, and all harmonic intervals, as Nicomachus already had. Boethius's exposition differs from Nicomachus's only in its lengthy illustration, although his specification of the relevant dialogue, the Timaeus, is once again noteworthy. The fact that he and Nicomachus affirm the utility of the method without actually explaining it, however, tells us what we might already have surmised, namely, in context, the connection with the Timaeus is incidental. And to that extent, it is also redolent of Theon of Smyrna's Expositio. But Boethius undoubtedly regarded it as an important reminder, the mention of the Timaeus as an important reminder of the philosophical origins of the theory under consideration. So when he doggedly follows Nicomachus, but then departs from him, it's because Nicomachus says this is good to understand a certain Platonic theorem, and he corrects him and says, this is good for understanding Plato's Timaeus. And so where there's an ambiguity in the Timaean theory, which Nicomachus' exposition is designed to smooth out for beginners, and Boethius shares that, he nevertheless drives the reader, presumably beginning students, back to the Timaeus, instead of leaving it just as it is. Our final example, number 2 on the handout, De Arithmetica 232, leads in the same general direction. The context is those cosmographers whose first principles are rooted in mathematics. Boethius, of course, follows Nicomachus again, but with a notable degree of compression. First up is Plato, whom Boethius anticipates with observations concerning unity, the infinitely immutable principle, and all that participates in being, qua the nature of the same, eustem substantiae. A Timaean echo to replace Nicomachus's explanation of heteromechic and tautomechic numbers, squares, or rectangles. Boethius reconvenes with Nicomachus on mention of Plato, where he once again specifies the Timaeus, 35a, but Nicomachus does not, and yet his Latin is otherwise a close approximation of Nicomachus's Greek. Both then proceed in lockstep to Philolaus on the emergence of things as harmonious conjunctions of unity and duality, odd and even, determinate and indeterminate, and so on. The pattern, in other words, repeats, where Nicomachus references Plato in a way that leaves the distinction between him, Plato, and Pythagoras, whoever that is actually. He leaves that distinction vague, and that is a tendency which will be shared by Chalcidius 2.5 centuries later. Boethius steadfastly brings the Timaeus back into focus as the most important foundation text. Now, I don't want to oversimplify matters, for a number of passages in De Arithmetica and in De Musica, A, reference Plato without mentioning the Timaeus, or they silently reference or target the Timaeus without mentioning Plato. But these 3 passages form a convenient starting point for consideration of Boethius's method of balancing Nicomachus and Plato. None necessitates the assumption that he had the Timaeus open before him as he wrote, but then the same was to hold true for the Consolatio at the end of his life, albeit for very different reasons. To conclude this part of the talk, I turn to a text, excuse me, that leads directly into the second part. That is the Consolation, Book 3, Metrum 9, O qui perpetua, and so on, a hymn whose aretologia, here in the Du-Stil, but in the passage just before this in the Relativ-Stil, is a poetic paraphrase of Timaeus 29e to 42d in 3 stages. The world body, verses 10 to 12, the world soul in verses 13 to 17, and then individual souls, verses 18 to 21, which is what we have at the end of the first part, at the beginning of the second part, pardon me, on the handout. I should like for the moment to focus on 2 observations, the first of which concerns verses 6 to 8. Tu cuncta superno duci sub exemplo, ipsa mundum mente gerens. At first glance, the 2 phrases appear, perhaps, to leave the question of the relationship between God and the ideas open. But a parallel phrase late in the 4th book of the dialogue confirms that Boethius views the ideas as thoughts in the mind of the creator. And I choose creator deliberately here, not an opifex. This is perhaps unremarkable given the body of related evidence reaching back to Philo, Seneca, and no doubt beyond. Boethius, in this regard, stands in a known tradition of interpreters of, we'll think of it as hyphenated Plato and Moses, as it were, all at once. He certainly viewed creation, and by that we mean, of course, ex nihilo creation, as an expression. In his theological works, he refers to it as the verbum of the divine will or voluntas, de fide catholica, de hebdomaribus, and so on. And like Chalcidius before him, if from the other side of the religious divide, he is unlikely to have viewed the Timaeus as altogether incompatible with the book of Genesis. as signaled, according to some, Klingner included, by what follows in verse 8 of the same poem, where we have the phrase similique in imagine formans, which could point in the direction of, and certainly does, Timaeus 29e to 30a, but others prefer to reference Genesis 1:25 to 27, and we have a passage in Book 2 which confirms that both, in a sense, are at work here, the Timaeus and Genesis. The second observation concerns verses 10 to 11. Tu numeris element legas ut frigera flammis arda conveniant liquidis. Although this points to the world body rather than soul, it intersects with what I understand to be one of the focal points of the Leuven project. The phrases frigera flammis and arda liquidis are periphrases that obliquely target water and air, means binding the two named elements of fire and earth. There's something puzzling about the periphrases in that when Plato comes to treat of qualities, hot, dry, cold, smooth, and so on, as perceived in the four elements at Timaeus 55d and followings, it is still in the context of the combination and dissolution of their associated geometrical solids, cube, icosahedron, octahedron, pyramid, which we have to assume is precisely what Boethius meant by the Latin numeris. The same periphrases recur, however, in a poem toward the end of the fourth book of the Consolatio, Humida sicis frigera flammis, which with the phrases alit ac profert on the one hand, and condit et aufert on the other, verses 30 to 32, book 4, poem 6, openly advertises itself as a resume of Aristotle's analysis of elemental and meteorological change in the second book of De Generatione et Corruptione. Those two phrases, alit ac profert, condit et aufert, might as well be the Greek genesis thora. That's exactly what's going on in that poem. It's poetic shorthand to the reader to say, take out your copy of De Generatione et Corruptione. This poetry will now make philosophical sense. It's very precise. At the center of which, of course, are the paired contrarieties of hot, cold, and moist, dry. In Boethius's poetic Latin, flamma, frigus, liquidum, aridum, or humidum, sicu. What we're seeing, in other words, is Boethius's instinct for finding harmony between Plato and Aristotle, a harmony which will appear later in connection with the soul proper, as we will see presently. These thoughts, I'm aware, barely skim the surface of this subject, which requires extensive investigation. But there nevertheless are some provisional conclusions of which we may be confident in the meantime. At about age 25, Boethius embarked on a philosophical project, the foundations of which involved working out the taxonomy of the four mathematical sciences and expounding their core principles as the first steps in a philosophical education. He simultaneously commented on Porphyry's Isagoge in Victorinus' translation, but soon realized that he would have to work from his own translations, so that it wasn't until about 515, a decade at most before his death, that he would announce the ambitious plan of translating, commenting on, and harmonizing all of Plato and Aristotle. It is also certain that by about the same time, he had already digested Macrobius's commentary on Cicero's Somnium Scipionis, which would have stimulated further thinking about the Timaeus, not to mention Plotinus and others, on the soul. But Macrobius's influence leaves few traces in the extant corpus. It's a bit of a puzzle. And the argumentum ex silentio kicks in because he mentions the book, he mentions the commentary of Macrobius and almost tells you what page you need to go to look up something. But then I can't find traces of Macrobius's influence in his own work. What are we entitled to assume? In about the year 520, he explicitly quotes from Cicero's Timaeus, 27d, but the question of whether he ever had access to Chalcidius's translation and commentary for me remains open, although Beatrice Bacouche and others have noted similarities to suggest that he did. In De Arithmetica and De Musica, we are unlikely, in my opinion, to find evidence indicative of a distinctively Boethian interpretation of the Platonic world soul. While for different reasons altogether, in his Consolatio is probably not the work in which we should be searching for one. Let's turn then to the question of the human soul. As I've mentioned, the Timaean hymn bridges conveniently to the second part of this talk, where I once again begin with two observations. First, there's the clarity with which verses 18 to 22, which you have number 4 on the handout, distill the basics of Plato's account of individual souls while leaving us to infer for them a parabolic journey of descent, conversion, in the phrase ad te conversa, so epistrophe, and return rather than cycles of rebirth as at Timaeus 41d to 42d. Secondly, the hymn inaugurates a series of 3 poems which at strictly regulated intervals target the Platonic first cosmology, as in the Timaeus, samples 3 and 4 on the handout, anamnesis, so the Meno and Fido, and I think, what is the phrase? Rogati sponte and so on, must mean the Meno. The slave boy is asked a question and spontaneously gives an answer. And thirdly, the winged ascent of souls, Phaedrus, passage 6 on the handout. Now, in 1977, Hermann Trenkel argued that our text of the Consolatio is incomplete on grounds, inter alia, of Philosophia's concern over Boethius's invocation of the traditional definition of man, of himself, that's the way she puts it, as a rational, mortal animal, which, Trenkel thought, signals a 6th unwritten book on the immortality of the soul. His arguments fail on all fronts, in my opinion, but they do help to stimulate reflection about why Boethius handles this concern as he does. And in that regard, we might do well to start with its first appearance in a remark delivered by Philosophia early on in the work, Book 2, Chapter 4. It's not on the handout. I'll just read you my English translation. She says to her interlocutor Boethius, and since you are still the person who, I know, have been deeply persuaded by numerous proofs that human minds, she uses the word minds, are by no means mortal, and since it is clear that the fortuitous happiness of the body is ended by death, you cannot doubt now that if such happiness does or can confer happiness, then mortal beings descend into misery when death occasions their end. Now, her argument is avowedly rhetorical. She describes it as rhetorica suadela, but intended to jog Boethius's memory immediately before her application of what are described as stronger dialectical therapies, validiora fomenta. The gist of it is that since the body no longer confers pleasure after it perishes, its loss must occasion unhappiness in the mind, given the mind's immortality. That was what was assumed. But if so, then unhappiness and happiness concern the mind rather than the body, QED. No attempt to demonstrate that the mind or the soul is immortal follows, but the proposition is assumed here and will be elaborated or recalled to memory over the course of the remaining books. As to the different stages of that elaboration, shortly after the passage just quoted, she makes the following observation concerning the mobility or variability of the human soul, and says, for such is the condition of human nature that it excels beyond other realities when it knows itself, but drives itself down below the level of beasts when it ceases to do so. For it is natural for other living beings to be ignorant of themselves, but a failure in human beings to do so. And here a core feature of Boethius's psychology emerges. It can be summed up very simply. Individual souls become and are what they think. And we come now to passage 7 on the handout, where we have a section from the 4th prose passage in the 4th book, where she says, just see what the eternal law ordains. Conform your mind to better things, and there is no need of a judge to confer rewards. For on your own, you have joined yourself to things of a higher order. But turn aside to worse things, but do not look abroad for one to exact retribution, for on your own, you have thrust yourself down among things of a lower order, as though by shifting your gaze between the sordid ground and the sky with all other external factors out of the way, just by reason of your gazing, you were to appear to be in the mud at one moment and amidst the stars at the next. But you will say, the common herd does not look or gaze up at the stars. Well then, are we to join those whom we have shown to be the likenesses of beasts? What if after having completely lost his sight, someone forgot that he'd even possessed it and so thought of himself as lacking nothing necessary to the completion of his human state? Surely we, with our ability to see, would not share the views of a blind person. Now, Philosophia speaks here of likenesses rather than on pure ontological change. And she does the same when she inverts the Circe myth in the poem that follows in order to explain the inner mechanics of beastly souls. The lion is Boethius's preferred figure for tyranny, which is, of course, central to the Consolation, figure of Theodoric, Nero. And at the center of his reflection on the tyrannous soul is the theme of intemperantia, akrateia, a wanton lack of self-control. And so we get this Latin, ira intemperans fremit, leonis animum gestar credatur. You see a person, you encounter a person foaming at the mouth, unable to control his ira. That person should be believed to be giving birth to or carrying the soul or mind of a lion. The pairing of Latin ira and libido in the poetic anatomy of tyranny that immediately precedes this brings to the surface a Latin tradition extending from Cicero to Macrobius by way of Apuleius, and Chalcidius, and Macrobius, yeah, whom I already mentioned, a Latin tradition of translating ira and libido, using them to translate thumos and epithumia, with either ira or iracundia, and then on the other side, libido or cupido. And of course, logos will be ratio. And from this linguistic detail, we can gather that dominance of the thymoidic part of the soul is for Boethius the same, in some sense, in the human soul, in the tyrannous human soul, as it is in that of a lion. Unlike in the case of Odysseus's crew members, the tyrant's body or form remains while his mind changes. The language of similitudes being Boethius's way of circumventing reference to cycles of rebirth, which has been emphatically rejected in the same prose section, and rejected in language that is reminiscent of his De Fide Catholica, so on explicitly Christian grounds. Moreover, there's no mention of similitudes in Book 3, when Philosophia describes the participation in divinity as deification pure and simple. Omnis igitur beatus Deus. Here, a complication enters, which I don't have time to enter into, and the human soul becoming, human beings becoming like beasts on the one hand. Book 4, human beings, when they achieve happiness, becoming, not like, but becoming gods by participation, he specifies, will in some loosely Platonic sense be self-explanatory, but it does leave a lot of unanswered questions. And to answer those, I think we have to turn to the 6th chapter of his Contra Iutucan et Nestorium. In other words, one of the theological works where Boethius has a deeper exploration that points in the direction of Alexander's De Mixtione, peripatetic interpretation of a Stoic conundrum about intermixture. And in that case, the Christological context, how does humanity become divinity? And in the incarnation, conversely, how does divinity become humanity? What's actually involved in that? So this would, if viewed properly and fully spelled out, would be another case of this sort of harmonization, because you will see it as a matter of participation, but he'll explain the mechanics, I believe, in this peripatetic way that we know from Alexander of Aphrodisias. And moreover, he'll have at some point to explain what he means by participation, because we have the horns of the dilemma that drive the De Hebdomadibus. How is it that the divine order, the created order, is good? Well, if it's substantially good, then we're headed in the direction of pantheism. That's not acceptable. If it's good only by participation, then it is not intrinsically good, because what you participate in and acquire through participation is something you don't, by definition, possess. And that's not acceptable either. So there's a complexity lurking in the background here, which will lead in two different directions. But I think insofar as we can piece together what Boethius actually thought it meant for a human soul to become a lion's soul or a soul of a god by participation, Aristotle will be brought in, like the Marines, to help rescue the situation. So far then, the consequences of moral developments that cause embodied souls to move between beastly and divine states. What about the lives of souls before and after their embodiment? I begin by noting that although in the Opuscula Sacra, Boethius is clear about the eternal rewards and punishments that await them after death and employs language that is consistent with that of the Consolatio, he is silent about their status before embodiment, apart perhaps from a reference to the article of faith that the number of angelic souls will eventually have to be restored, meaning some level, the souls are there, and there will have to be some restoration, but he leaves this an entirely unaddressed question. Otherwise, the Consolatio is our guide, where, as we have seen, Boethius first follows the Timaeus in describing souls as having been sown into astral bodies, curibus seris, at the point of their first incarnation, the Genesis Prote, passage 4 on the handout. The most informative passage thereafter is in the 5th book, where Philosophia describes a fourfold descent from first, absolutely free contemplation of the divine, to second, astral embodiment. That's the okemata, the kurus. Thirdly, incorporation in a human frame. And fourthly, a moral fall characterized by severe enslavement and oblivion. And that is number 8 on the handout, which I'll translate for you. Or read my translation for you. For penetrating judgment, an incorrupt will, and an effective power vis-a-vis the objects of desire is immediately to hand for supernal divine beings, whereas human souls inevitably are freer when they maintain themselves in contemplation of the divine mind, less so when they slip down to the level of bodies, and less so again when they are bound in earthly frames. Their ultimate servitude, however, comes when, after succumbing to vices, vitiis deditae, they have fallen from possession of the reason intrinsic to them. For once they have cast their gaze down from the light of the supreme truth to lower and darker realities, they immediately become blurred by a mist of ignorance. They are disturbed by pernicious passions, by exceeding and consenting to which they assist the servitude they have brought upon themselves, and are in some sense captives due to their very freedom. This is interestingly presaged by a passage in Boethius's philosophically least mature work, the first commentary on Porphyry's Isagoge. This is passage 9 in the handout, where the highest realities, the intellectibilia, or noeta, as he explains, are described as descending through bodily contagion, corporum tactu, to the level of intelligibilia. He doesn't tell us the Greek for it, but I surmise it might be something like noera, thereby becoming the objects of their contemplation. Non magis ipsa intelligantur quam intelligant. I mentioned the argumentum excellentio and its strength or weakness vis-a-vis Macrobius, and here's a point in case. I thought when I started this paper, started to plan this paper out, that I would begin with this passage and with the first book, chapter 12 of Macrobius's commentary on the Somnium, where we have this famous passage that runs so closely to Porphyry's De Antra Nympharum, where Numenius's view of the spherical soul becoming elongated into conical. You all know it. And there might be some way of teasing out a connection here, but I have not found it. It's not there. And yet we know he read the work. He recommends that his readers should read it. So the question remains, is this part of the equation or not? I don't feel I have the license to include it because he hasn't mentioned it here. Whether it will help me to interpret it remains to be seen. There's a noteworthy ambiguity between passages 8 and 9 insofar as the latter, passage 9, breeds the impression that bodily contagion is the cause of descent, whereas the former describes the stages of descent as consequences of changes in the will. So we begin with incorrupta voluntas, and then we end with a description of these souls being given over or having given themselves over to vice, namely as stages in the soul's forfeiture of its freedom. The latter, as expressed in passage 8, undoubtedly reflects Boethius's mature view, but we will be hard-pressed to identify with any precision the psychic mechanisms that, in his view, trigger the processes of descent and ascent. In the case of descent, for example, Boethius does not invoke, anything resembling the impulse of Tolma, described by Plotinus as the beginning of evil for souls, and that, despite the fact that it might have mapped conveniently onto Augustine's appeal to superbia as the origin of sin in the city of God and other works, not to mention his use of this phrase, per superbiae malum, in reference to Lucifer, in his own De Fide Catholica. Why did Lucifer fall? Per superbiae malum. And I would have thought, given his closeness to Augustine on so many things, if we're not seeing the connection with Tolma, Enneads 5114, this form of it might have emerged, but it doesn't. And it leaves us to try to figure out how this happens. What we get in the Consolatio, which of course is a work of philosophical rather than theological consolation, so what are our expectations and what are the limits on those expectations, is the moral drawn at the end of the Orpheus poem with which the third book concludes, and that's number 10 on the handout. And it can be expressed, Sunt Tomos, do not look back during your ascent out of darkness on pain of losing what you desire above all else, namely the good, capital G. Given that this comes immediately before the poem inspired by Plato's Phaedrus, the one that's number 6 on the handout, we have 3 poems at the end of book 3. Once the Timaeus enters at the very center of the Consolatio in poetic form, 3 metrum 9, we start until the beginning of the first book to skip a poem and then have the second poem digest or distill some Platonic doctrine. 3 metrum 9, Timaeus. 3 metrum 11, Anamnesis. Skip a poem. 4 metrum 1, Phaedrus. Right? This is very, very carefully controlled. Given that this comes immediately before the poem inspired by Plato's Phaedrus, it is difficult not to see it as an allegorical reading of that point in the latter, 248 ADE, where the charioteer loses control over his steeds and descends into cycles of rebirth, for which, of course, there is no place in the Consolatio. As to mechanisms associated with the soul's conversion and ascent, on the other hand, I believe it comes down to a passage in Book 5 where the stakes of the argument for free choice and free will are raised to their highest level. In the absence of free will, Boethius, the interlocutor, pleads, prayer, the soul's sole form of communication, the soul's sole form of communication with God, and that through which it petitions the intervention of divina gratia, 53333, is rendered meaningless, he says, which has a cascading effect on the whole integrity of human life. Our laws will be meaningless, rewards and punishments will be meaningless, and so on and so forth. Now, I mentioned earlier that we would encounter another example of Boethius's impulse to harmonize Plato and Aristotle, and before concluding, I would like to reflect on a poem in the 5th book, number 11 on the handout, 5 metrum 4. Boethius kept Aristotle quietly in the background for the second half of book 3, where the Timaeus and Meno take over, and for book 4, where the Phaedrus and then the Gorgias, the Polus Colloquy, are center stage. At the beginning of book 5, however, Aristotle suddenly emerges from silence. He comes into view first with the excursus on chance occurrences in 5.1, then with the discussion, the famous one, of future contingents. So in the first case, it was Physics, Book 2. Now it's De Interpretatione, Chapter 9. And finally, in connection with the question of the perpetuity or eternity of the world, where he quotes De Caelo 2.1, where Plato is given the final word. at the very end of the work. But Aristotle also works silently behind the scenes in 5 Metrum 4, this poem we have in number 11, where the words efficiens causa in verses 26 and 27 leap out as poetic code for De Anima 3.5, 430, A11 to 12, heteron de to aetian kai poietikon, the active capacity of intellect over and above its passive one. And just in case we missed the illusion, Boethius lays it bare in targeting the agent intellect, animus agens, in his Latin, at the beginning of the following prose section. The concern emerges here because the pendulum has swung from Boethius's, the interlocutor's, emphatic rejection of an Epicurean view, according to which the atomic swerve, casus, as he calls it, undercuts divine governance at the beginning of the work, but does leave room for a free will, 1.6. To the other extreme, where an equally emphatic affirmation of divine providence and fate suddenly threatens to obliterate freedom of choice, which is what occasions the problem of Book 5, and that is at 4.6.19. That's the Stoic alternative, and the reason, indeed, for Philosophia's allusion to Cicero's De Fato immediately after this poem. From the facts first, that Boethius's solution to the dilemma arises out of his extensive commentary on De Interpretatione 9, and second, that it invokes the principle that knowledge reflects the powers of knowing subjects rather than the natures of its known objects. It follows that that solution will target Stoic theories of cognition, as we have it in the poem, with which he had also grappled in the same commentary. Although this may not amount to an example of harmonization of doctrines stricto sensu, unlike the first case I mentioned, it at the very least suggests that a form of compatibilism, more precisely Boethius's confidence in his final days, that Aristotle was an indispensable piece of the puzzle, despite the criticisms leveled by Aristotle in the De Anima at Plato's account of soul and accounts of other Platonists. It's a bit of a mystery, but one way or the other, he thinks bringing in the agent intellect to answer a Stoic problem is going to help to complete or form part of the picture of what the human soul is and does. In closing, we might ask why Boethius handled the question of the immortality of the human soul as he did, given the possibility that his silence might leave future readers, Tranquilla, to wonder whether he had failed to complete his philosophical last will and testament. Tranquilla's arguments for the incompleteness of our text fail, as I have mentioned, but we may wonder, nevertheless, why Boethius didn't mount a proof of the soul's immortality as in Plato's Phaedo, a dialogue of particular significance for the Consolatio. Not to mention the parallelism, the obvious parallelism he's drawing between himself and Socrates. The search for an answer leads back to the first book, where Philosophia poses 4 questions to diagnose Boethius, the interlocutor's malaise. And in which her first 3 questions concern his understanding of the world at large, while the 4th concerns the individual human soul, and his own in particular. That's the way she poses it. Boethius, she concludes, suffers from a lapse of memory concerning the immortality of his own soul. Answers to 2 of her questions are derived through proofs. They are proofs and demonstrations that occupy the second half of Book 3, whereas the answers to the other 2 questions, the first and the 4th, are assumed as axiomatic premises for further speculation. Here's one thing that Tranquilla did not see. Moreover, the 2 proofs mounted in Book 3 lead to 2 sides of a single conclusion, namely that the world is governed by the good, capital G, as both final cause and efficient cause of all that exists, which Boethius accepts but is unsatisfied with, since they do not furnish the theodicy he has sought from the start, unde malum, Book 1, Chapter 4. In other words, it's all good and well to know that everything that happens in the world, sub or superlunary, is pushed from behind by the good, capital G, and is drawn from ahead as final cause by the good, capital G. But what does that have to do with me? Unde malum. Why am I then suffering this? And that is why the Gorgias takes over in Book 4, which is an extended reflection on the punishments or rewards for good or evil during and after this life. Philosophia shies away from the speculation about the providential administration of lots in the afterlife, but that an afterlife awaits every human soul is never in question. To imagine an unwritten sixth book dedicated to proofs for the immortality of the soul is, in other words, and in my opinion, to imagine a grotesque distortion of the Consolatio as we have it. Otherwise, Schmidt-Kohl, with whom I began, gathered the motifs which show Boethius' picture of the soul as in some sense post-Plotinian or post-Proclean, but without explaining what that actually means. My own view is that it will be very hard, if not impossible, to pin his psychology down with precision, and that because of the historical circumstances of his life. An incidental consideration in theory. Neither De Arithmetica nor De Musica is a work in which scope is given to separate exploration of the soul as such, although Boethius is at pains to intimate that both works rest on a foundation which is essentially Platonic, if not also Pythagorean. Conversely, the Consolatio was written under circumstances which did not favor or indeed require separate proof of the soul's immortality, a deeply rooted proposition temporarily obscured by a cloud of oblivion, in the context of the Inszenierung, or the mise en scène of the work. My guess is that Boethius wrote at least part of the Consolatio while detained in the baptistry at Verona, under some kind of house arrest that involved limited access to books, probably a basic selection of Plato and Aristotle, his philosophical touchstones, as the pressures leading to his death in the Ager Calventianus mounted. Choices had to be made about what was to be demonstrated and what could be summoned back to memory through judicious allusion, poetic too, to core doctrines and texts of Plato and, to a lesser extent, Aristotle. Be that as it may, he left the works which, along with Chalcidius's translation of and commentary on Timaeus 17a to 53c, proved foundational for the educational rebuilding that would have to be done from the 9th through the 12th centuries. Thank you for your attention.